The newspaper was still on the kitchen table when I came downstairs. My mother had left it there, folded back to a specific page, the way she folded things when she wanted someone to notice them without having to explain why she wanted them noticed. I recognized the habit. She had been doing it my whole life with grocery lists, with school permission forms, with articles about career paths she thought I should consider. The fold was always precise. Always deliberate. Always innocent looking. I was 26 years old, a marketing assistant at a mid-size firm in the city, and I had been living back at my parents' house for 3 months while my apartment was being renovated. 3 months of Sunday dinners and my father's opinions about my career trajectory and my mother Patricia's particular brand of management through suggestion. I had been counting the weeks until the renovation finished. I picked up the newspaper. The article was on the business page, not the front, not the back, the specific inside placement that meant significant but not sensational. The headline read, "Local entrepreneur quietly builds hotel empire worth over $12 million." There was a photograph beside it. A man in his late 60s, standing in front of a 4-story property with the unhurried ease of someone who had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. I knew that face. I hadn't seen it in 3 years. Martin, my grandfather, my father David's father, looked directly at the camera with the same expression I remembered from childhood, steady, private, faintly amused by something only he could see. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. His hair was whiter than I remembered. Everything else was exactly the same. I set the newspaper down. My parents were in the hallway. I could hear them, not the words, just the register of the conversation, the particular low-frequency murmur of 2 people discussing something they hadn't decided how to present yet. My father's voice had a quality I recognized from business calls, a kind of focused energy that he only produced when he was planning something. My mother's responses were shorter, affirmative, the sound of someone being brought into an alignment that had already been reached. I stood at the kitchen table with my hand still on the newspaper and felt something tighten in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. 3 years. Martin and I had been estranged for 3 years, not by my choice, not by his, but by the slow gravitational pull of a family that had stopped finding his presence convenient and had communicated that inconvenience in the wordless, efficient way families do. Fewer invitations. Shorter visits. My father's sighs when Martin's name came up. My mother's careful redirections. I had been 23 when the distance had solidified into something that felt permanent, and I had been ashamed of my own passivity in letting it happen. I had told myself it wasn't my place to intervene. That had been the first thing I got wrong. My grandfather had built something extraordinary, and nobody in our family had known about it, or so I had believed until that moment in the kitchen. The article described a portfolio of 7 boutique hotels spread across 3 counties, all operating under a brand called the Hearthstone Collection. The first property had been purchased quietly 11 years ago, a failing guest house that Martin had renovated himself over 18 months. The second had followed 2 years later. Then a third. Each acquisition had been funded by the previous property's profits, compounded with the patience of someone who understood that wealth built slowly was the only kind that lasted. By the time the business journalist had tracked down the story, the portfolio was valued at $12.4 million and had won 2 regional hospitality awards. Martin had done all of this alone. No partners, no investors, no family involvement. I sat down at the kitchen table and read the entire article twice. My father came into the kitchen while I was reading the second time. He was dressed for the day already, pressed shirt, the kind of deliberate presentation he brought to situations he wanted to control. He looked at the newspaper in my hands and then at me, and something moved across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite calculation but inhabited the uncomfortable territory between them. "You saw it," he said. "Just now." I kept my voice neutral. "Did you know about any of this?" A pause. Brief, specific. "Not the scale of it, no." He moved to the coffee maker. "Your grandfather always kept things close to the chest. That was true. Martin had always been a private man, not secretive exactly, but self-contained in the way of people who have learned that sharing plans invites interference, and who have decided that the most efficient protection is simply not announcing what you're building until it's built. I had always respected that quality in him. My father had always found it frustrating. I was thinking, my father said, his back to me, pouring coffee with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of communication, that we should reach out. It's been too long. Family is family. I looked at the newspaper. Then at his back. Family is family. 3 years of silence, 3 years of carefully engineered distance, and now, the morning after a newspaper article revealed $12 million, family was family. Something shifted inside me that I couldn't name yet. Not anger, not quite. Something quieter and more considered. The feeling of a piece clicking into place in a puzzle you hadn't realized you were solving. I folded the newspaper back the way my mother had left it and put it exactly where I'd found it. Sure, I said. That sounds like a good idea. My voice was steady. My hands were steady. Inside, something had already changed entirely. The last time I had seen Martin was at a family gathering 3 years earlier, a birthday dinner that my father had organized for reasons that, in retrospect, I now understood had more to do with appearances than affection. Martin had arrived on time, brought a bottle of wine that my father had accepted without comment, and sat at the end of the table with the particular quietness of a man who understands he is being tolerated rather than welcomed. He had talked to me. That was the thing I remembered most clearly, not the dinner, not my parents' conversation, not the specific moment the evening had turned awkward, but Martin turning to me with his steady attention and asking about my work, my ambitions, what I was building. He had always asked about building. It was his native language. I had driven him home afterward. In the car, he had said, "You're going to be good at whatever you decide to be good at, Sarah. Don't let anyone else decide what that is." I had thanked him and told him I'd call. I hadn't called. Not because I hadn't wanted to. Because every time I'd reached for the phone, I'd felt the weight of my parents' disapproval, not stated, never stated, just present in the atmosphere of the house like weather. My father's carefully neutral expression when Martin's name came up. My mother's efficient subject changes. The unspoken message, delivered over years of small signals, that enthusiasm for Martin was a social miscalculation. I had been 23 and had chosen the path of least resistance. And I had spent 3 years carrying the low-grade shame of that choice without ever naming it clearly enough to do anything about it. Looking back now, my silence during those 3 years was not passive. It was a decision with consequences, for Martin, for me, for the family dynamic I had told myself I had no power to change. Silence is never neutral. It always means something, to someone. That evening my father called Martin. I wasn't in the room for the beginning of it. I heard the middle, my father's voice carrying through the house with the warm, slightly formal register he used for calls that mattered, the register of a man performing graciousness. "It's been too long. We've been thinking about you. Patricia and I would love to have you for dinner." Pause. "Next week?" "Whenever suits you." I stood in the hallway outside the study with a glass of water I'd forgotten to drink and listened to the cadence of it. Martin agreed to come. Of course he did. He was a man who had spent years being denied access to his own family, and here was the door opening, even if the hand opening it was doing so for reasons that had nothing to do with genuine welcome. He would come because he had more generosity than the situation deserved. That thought sat in me like something heavy. I went to my room and opened my laptop and read the newspaper article again, slowly this time, noting the specific details. The first property. The timeline. The patient, methodical accumulation. Martin had built all of this during the same years my family had been finding him inconvenient. While they were deciding he had nothing to offer, he had been quietly constructing something remarkable. I thought about the last thing he'd said to me in the car. "Don't let anyone else decide what that is." I closed the laptop. I had some decisions to make. The dinner was set for the following Thursday. In the days between, my parents' household underwent a subtle but unmistakable reorganization, the kind that happens when people are preparing to perform rather than simply to live. My mother hired a cleaning service for a house that was already clean. My father came home one evening with 2 bottles of wine that were visibly more expensive than his usual selection. The dining room table, which had been functioning as a repository for unopened mail and my mother's planning notebooks, was cleared and set with the good tablecloth. None of this was announced. It simply happened, in the efficient, unspoken way my parents coordinated when they agreed on an objective. I watched it all from the periphery of the house, moving through my days, commuting to the office, managing the marketing campaigns I'd been assigned, eating dinner at the kitchen counter while my parents occupied the dining room, and I held what I knew carefully, the way you hold something fragile. Not yet ready to name it. Not yet ready to act on it. Still gathering. My work had been going well, which provided a useful counterweight to the unease at home. I had been with the firm for 2 years and had recently been given more responsibility on a hotel client account, a regional chain that was rebranding, needing a full marketing refresh. I knew more about boutique hotel positioning than most people my age, partly from the work and partly because I'd grown up listening to Martin talk about hospitality, about the specific art of making a stranger feel at home. He had talked about it the way some people talk about cooking, with the pleasure of someone who had found the thing they were genuinely good at. I hadn't connected those conversations to any concrete reality at the time. He'd been retired, as far as I'd known. Or working in some vague property management capacity that my father described, when he described it at all, with the particular flatness he reserved for things he didn't consider worth discussing. That framing now looked different. My father had known Martin was involved in property. He had characterized it as modest, marginal, something adjacent to actual success. I had absorbed that characterization the way children absorb their parents' assessments, not as opinion but as fact, as the correct and reliable interpretation of a person I didn't have enough independent data to evaluate on my own terms. I understood then, sitting at my desk between client calls, that I had never actually formed my own view of my grandfather. I had inherited my father's view, polished it slightly with affection, and called it knowledge. That was not the same thing. Not even close. Martin arrived on Thursday at 7, exactly on time. He looked well. Better than the photograph, actually, more present, more substantial, the way people look when a photograph has caught them in a moment of stillness that doesn't quite capture their normal energy. He brought flowers for my mother, which she accepted with the warm graciousness she produced effortlessly on occasions that required it, and he shook my father's hand with the direct, unhesitating grip of a man who had decided to show up fully regardless of the circumstances. When he saw me, something in his face simplified. "Sarah." He said my name the way he always had, with a weight that meant I see you, specifically you, not just the social acknowledgement of a name. "Hi, Martin." I stepped forward and hugged him and felt the particular solidity of him, the same as I remembered, unchanged in any essential way by 3 years of distance. "You look good." "You look like yourself," he said. "That's better." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything, and we moved toward the dining room and the evening began. My parents were flawless. That was the word that kept surfacing as I watched them. My father was warm, engaged, asking questions about the hotels with an interest that appeared entirely genuine. My mother served the meal with her usual efficiency and grace, refilling glasses at exactly the right moments, steering conversations away from any potential awkwardness with the practiced ease of someone who had been managing social situations for decades. Martin answered their questions with the same measured openness he brought to everything. He talked about the first property, the failing guest house, the 18-month renovation, with a matter-of-fact pleasure that was entirely free of performance. He wasn't displaying success. He was just answering questions about work he found meaningful. My father asked about the current valuation. It was asked casually, nested between questions about the renovation process and the staffing model, and if you weren't paying close attention, it would have sounded like simple curiosity. I was paying close attention. Martin answered without hesitation. 12.4 million, as of the last formal appraisal. 7 properties. A small permanent staff at each location, supplemented by seasonal workers. Fully owned, no debt. My father nodded with the composed appreciation of someone receiving information they will be processing later at length. I reached for my water glass and kept my face neutral and filed everything away. After dinner, while my mother and Martin were talking in the sitting room, my father found me in the kitchen on the pretext of helping clear plates. "He's done well," he said, with a generosity in his voice that cost him nothing because it was entirely retrospective. "He has," I agreed. "I think there could be an opportunity." He said it lightly, testing the weight of it in the air. "He's built something impressive, but he's doing it alone. At his age, that's a vulnerability. Someone with business experience could add real value." I rinsed a plate and set it in the rack. "What kind of value?" I said. "Management. Growth strategy. The kind of thing that turns a good business into a great one." He leaned against the counter. "I've been thinking about reaching out to some contacts. People who could help structure a proper partnership." A partnership. There it was, not hidden, not dressed up, just placed on the table with the confidence of a man who had not yet considered that the table might not be his to set things on. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I needed to understand the full shape of what was being planned before I said anything that would make me visible as an obstacle. I pretended to be absorbed in the dishes. I was already thinking about who I could call. The second dinner happened 2 weeks later. My father had initiated it, a casual suggestion, framed as continuation rather than escalation, the natural follow-up to a pleasant evening. Martin had accepted again. And this time, partway through the meal, my father produced a folder. He presented it as something he'd put together out of genuine interest, some thoughts on growth strategy, potential acquisition targets in adjacent markets, a rough sketch of what a management structure might look like if the Hearthstone collection were to scale. He slid it across the table to Martin with the practiced ease of a man who had been in enough business meetings to know how to make a document feel like a gift. Martin picked it up. "Read the first page." "Set it down." "You've put work into this," he said. "I find the space interesting," my father said. "I appreciate the thought." Martin's voice was even, carrying nothing that could be objected to. "I'll have a look at it properly." He didn't take the folder home. He left it on the table when the evening ended, placed neatly beside his napkin, not forgotten, I was certain, but deliberately declined. The gesture was so quiet that my parents may not have registered it as one. I registered it. Something about that moment clarified things for me in a way the previous 2 weeks hadn't quite managed. Martin knew exactly what was happening. He was not confused, not flattered, not being carefully managed. He was a man who had spent 11 years building a business in deliberate obscurity, who understood the difference between people who wanted to be near his work and people who wanted to be near his success. He had seen this before. He was seeing it now. The question I was carrying, the one I hadn't yet named clearly enough to ask, was not whether my father's interest was genuine. That question had answered itself. The question was how far he would take it when the folder was left on the table. I found out sooner than I expected. 3 days after the second dinner, I came home from work to find my father on the phone in the study with the door half open. I was passing in the hallway, not deliberately listening, just moving through the house, and I caught a fragment of the conversation that stopped me where I stood. "Needs to understand that the structure is inefficient. If you won't listen to reason, we create the conditions for the conversation." A pause. "Reputation management works both ways, Roy. A few well-placed reviews, the right platforms, and suddenly the proposition looks different." Roy. I didn't know anyone named Roy. Reputation management works both ways. I moved past the door without breaking stride. Went to my room. Sat on the edge of the bed and held what I'd just heard, the way you hold something that has changed temperature unexpectedly, carefully, without knowing yet what to do with it. My father was planning to damage Martin's hotel reputation. That was what well-placed reviews on the right platforms meant in the language of someone who had spent years in business. Fake negative reviews, seeded across the hospitality review sites, designed to create the appearance of problems that didn't exist. Not to destroy the business, to soften it, to make Martin feel the precariousness of doing it alone, to manufacture the exact vulnerability my father had diagnosed at the dinner table and then engineer its arrival. I sat very still for a long time. I had hoped I was wrong about my father's intentions. That hope was now closed. Looking back now, the folder left on the table had been the turning point, the moment my father's plan shifted from persuasion to something else entirely. When Martin declined to engage with the growth strategy on David's terms, the equation changed. What had been opportunism became something with a harder edge. I had sensed that shift the evening it happened and had not let myself follow the implication to its conclusion. That had cost 3 days. I wouldn't lose any more. I called Martin the next morning from a coffee shop near my office, where I could speak without being overheard. He answered on the second ring. "Sarah." The warmth in his voice hit me somewhere unprepared. "Martin. I need to talk to you about something." "Not on the phone, can I come and see you this weekend?" A pause. Then, with the quietness of someone who had been expecting a call of this nature, "Saturday morning. Come for breakfast." His house was 40 minutes outside the city, a modest property that had been his for 30 years, maintained with the same care he brought to everything but without display. The garden was winter bare but tended. The inside smelled like coffee and wood smoke and old books, the smell of a house that had been lived in seriously. I told him everything I'd heard. Not with embellishment, not with interpretation, just the words, as precisely as I could reconstruct them. Reputation management works both ways. A few well-placed reviews. The conditions for the conversation. Martin listened without expression. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the window where the winter light came through pale and thin. "He mentioned someone named Roy," I said. Martin turned back to me. "Roy Henderson. Your father has used him before, for competitive intelligence work, I believe. He's a private investigator." He said it without surprise, which meant he had already mapped some of the territory I was only beginning to enter. "You knew about Roy?" "I knew your father had that kind of resource." A pause. I didn't know he'd already decided to use it this way. Something in the way he said "this way" told me he had considered the possibility. That Martin had seen the folder on the table, left it there, and then gone home and prepared for the possibility that declining it gracefully would not be sufficient. "What do we do?" I asked. Martin looked at me, directly, with the full attention he had always given me and that I had not, until recently, understood the value of. "We document everything," he said. "And we find someone better than Roy." The person we found was a woman named Helen. She had been recommended by Diane Foster, Martin's attorney of 12 years, a compact, methodical woman who practiced out of a small office downtown and who had, upon being briefed on the situation, displayed the focused calm of someone who recognized the legal territory immediately and knew exactly which instruments applied to it. Helen was a former fraud investigator who had moved into private practice. She had short gray hair, a direct manner, and an almost complete absence of unnecessary movement, the kind of person who, when she sat down across from you, gave you the impression that everything she was about to say had already been thought through completely. She charged significant fees and was worth them. I met with her twice in the first week, in a conference room at Diane's office. Martin joined the second meeting. We laid out what we had, the overheard phone call, the context of the dinners, my father's prior use of Roy Henderson for competitive intelligence, the folder that had been left on the table. Helen listened, made precise notes, and asked 7 questions, each one identifying a gap in the evidence chain that would need to be filled. "The phone call is useful as context," she said. "But it's not documentation. What we need is a traceable payment to Henderson, communication records connecting the review activity to your father, and ideally a pattern across multiple platforms that can be attributed to a single coordinated source." She was already moving before the meeting ended. Meanwhile, I continued living in my parents' house, which required a particular discipline of performance that I had not previously needed to exercise. I came to dinner. I answered my mother's questions about work. I watched my father with the careful peripheral attention of someone trying not to appear to be watching, and I catalogued everything I noticed without reacting to any of it. He was on the phone more than usual. The calls happened in the study with the door closed now. He had adjusted after the half-open moment, which told me he had registered, at some level, that he'd been less careful than he should have been. He was also doing something on his laptop in the evenings that he minimized when anyone came near, which was not his usual behavior. My mother moved through all of this with her characteristic efficiency, either genuinely unaware of the specifics or choosing not to be. I couldn't determine which, and the uncertainty was its own kind of discomfort. Patricia had always operated at the level of outcome rather than method. She wanted the result, the path to it was David's domain. Whether that constituted innocence or willful blindness was a question I set aside because answering it didn't change what I needed to do. Helen's first findings came at the end of the second week. Roy Henderson had received a payment from a company registered to my father's name, a small consulting entity he'd set up years ago that had lain dormant, 4 days after the second dinner. The payment was categorized as research services. A second, larger payment had followed 6 days later, categorized as content strategy. Content strategy. Helen placed the payment records on the table between us with the specific neutrality of someone presenting evidence rather than commentary. I looked at the dates. The timeline ran directly from the folder left on the table to the phone call I'd overheard to the payments to Roy Henderson. Every step followed from the previous one with the mechanical certainty of a process that had been planned rather than improvised. That was the thing that took longest to sit with. This hadn't been reactive. My father hadn't panicked when Martin declined and reached for an available tool. He had planned for the declination. He had planned for what came next before Martin had even made his decision. Which meant that the dinners, the folder, the warm performance of family reconnection, all of it had always included this contingency. I had spent years believing that my father was opportunistic rather than strategic. The distinction mattered. An opportunist reaches for what's available when circumstances present it. A strategist positions the circumstances in advance. What the payment records told me was that I had been wrong about which one I was dealing with. Understanding that was uncomfortable in a way that went beyond this situation and touched something larger, the recognition that the story I had told myself about my father's character had been, like my story about Martin, an inherited interpretation rather than an observed reality. I had never truly looked at either of them on their own terms. The second finding was more specific. Helen had traced a cluster of negative reviews across 4 hotel review platforms, appearing across a 2-week period, targeting 3 of Martin's 7 properties, following a pattern consistent with coordinated rather than organic activity. The reviews shared structural similarities, specific language about cleanliness and management responsiveness, a consistent tone that read more like a template than genuine complaint, and IP address clustering that pointed to a small number of originating devices. Roy Henderson's professional history included 3 prior cases involving exactly this kind of review manipulation. The connection wasn't proven yet. But it was visible. Martin reviewed everything in a meeting with Diane and Helen on a Friday afternoon. I sat across from him and watched him read the payment records, and I thought about what this cost, not legally, not strategically, but personally. This was his son. The man who had signed those payments was the child Martin had raised, the person who carried his name, the one relationship that should have been exempt from the cold logic of financial calculation. He read everything without visible reaction. When he finished, he set the documents down precisely and looked at Diane. "What do we need to complete the chain?" he said. "Henderson's communication records and confirmation of his identity as the source of the review activity," Diane said. "Helen believes we can get both within 2 weeks." "Then let's get both," Martin said. "I had spent years thinking that strength was something you performed. Watching Martin in that room, I understood it differently, as something you produce quietly, without announcement, when the situation requires it. Not bravado. Not theater. Just the steady application of capacity to a problem that needs solving." Helen got both. Roy Henderson's communication records, obtained through legal channels with Diane's involvement, confirmed ongoing contact with my father throughout the review period. A series of brief, functional messages, delivery confirmations, platform reports, a final summary that described the review campaign in terms that left no ambiguity about its purpose or its authorship. The chain was complete. Diane drafted a formal notice. Martin reviewed it. A meeting was requested, framed as a family matter, with no indication of the specific agenda, for a Saturday afternoon at the Hearthstone Collection's flagship property, a converted manor house that Martin had renovated 8 years ago and that served as both hotel and administrative center. My father accepted the invitation. He arrived believing it was a conversation. He walked into a room that contained Martin, Diane, Helen, 2 hotel managers who had witnessed the review impact on their properties, and a complete documented record of everything he had done. I was there too. Standing near the window, not at the table. Present but not participating, because this was Martin's confrontation to conduct, and my role had been to get him the tools to conduct it, not to take it from him. My father walked in and saw the room and understood immediately. He didn't leave. That was the thing I had not predicted, that when my father walked into the room and understood the assembled purpose of it, he didn't turn around. He stood at the entrance for a moment, taking in the faces, the documents visible on the table, Martin sitting at its head with the composed authority of a man on his own ground. And then David walked to the chair across from Martin and sat down. I don't know whether that took courage or simply the absence of an alternative. But he sat down. Martin began without preamble. He laid out the timeline. The dinners. The folder. The payment records. The review activity and its traced origins. Helen presented the documentation in the methodical sequence she had clearly rehearsed, each piece placed on the table in order, each one building on the previous. Diane was present but silent, her role already complete in the preparation. My father listened to the entire presentation without interruption. When it was finished, the room was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of a silence that belongs after something irrevocable. "I wanted to protect the family's interests," my father said finally. Martin looked at him. "Which family?" No answer. "You ignored me for 10 years, Martin said, not with heat, with the steady temperature of someone who has already processed the anger and arrived at something cleaner. Not because of any conflict, not because of anything I did. Because you decided I had nothing useful to offer. You brought Patricia and Sarah along in that assessment without telling them that's what you were doing. You managed their relationship with me the same way you manage everything, by controlling access and framing the narrative." My father's jaw tightened slightly. "Then a newspaper article told you I was worth $12 million, Martin continued. And within a week you were calling me. Inviting me to dinner. Producing folders. And when I didn't respond to the folder the way you needed me to, you hired someone to manufacture the conditions that would make me feel the need for help." The hotel managers shifted slightly in their chairs. Helen was still. "I want to be precise about something," Martin said. "The legal exposure here is significant. Diane can explain the specifics, but the short version is that what you did constitutes defamation and tortious interference, and we have documentation sufficient to proceed on both counts." He paused. "I'm not going to pursue that, unless you give me a reason to." My father looked up. "What I want," Martin said, "is an acknowledgement. Not to me, in writing, formal, to Diane's office. An acknowledgement of what was done, what it was intended to accomplish, and that it will stop. And if I do that? Then we move forward. Whatever that looks like. The room waited. My father looked at the table. Then at Martin. Then, briefly, the only time during the entire meeting, at me. I didn't give him anything. I kept my face neutral and I held his gaze and I waited. He looked back at Martin. I'll provide the acknowledgement, he said. The meeting ended with the particular flatness of things that have been resolved in a room but whose weight will be carried elsewhere for a long time. My father left first, alone, without speaking to me in the hallway. The hotel managers left next, in a quiet exchange with Helen that I didn't hear. Martin walked Diane to her car. Helen gathered her documents with the efficient calm she'd brought to everything. I stood in the entrance hall of the Hearthstone's flagship property and looked at the space Martin had built, restored plasterwork, warm lighting, the specific quiet of a place that had been made with attention, and felt something inside me that was not triumph and not grief but some unnamed territory between them. He came back inside and found me there. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so." I paused. "Are you?" He considered it genuinely. "I've been better," he said. "I've also been worse." He looked around the entrance hall with the expression of someone taking accurate stock of something they have built. "He's still my son. That doesn't stop being true because of what he did." "I know. And you're still my granddaughter." He looked at me. "Nothing that happened in that room changes either of those things." I nodded. My throat was doing something I didn't want it to do in this space, so I focused on the plasterwork detail above the door and breathed slowly. "I should have called," I said. 3 years ago. I should have just called." "Yes," he said. Simply, without cushioning. "You should have. Then, you called when it mattered. That counts." My father submitted the written acknowledgement to Diane's office 9 days after the meeting. It was a single page. Precise, legally adequate, and in my father's handwriting, that same slightly forward-leaning script I had been reading my whole life on birthday cards and grocery lists and the margins of documents that had turned out to contain more than I'd understood at the time. He acknowledged the review campaign. He acknowledged the engagement of Roy Henderson for that purpose. He acknowledged that the intent had been to manufacture conditions favorable to a business negotiation with Martin. He did not apologize in that document. That came later, in a separate letter, addressed to Martin specifically, which I know about because Martin told me, not because I was shown it. My mother wrote to me. A careful letter, 3 paragraphs, that did not deny anything that had happened and did not ask for anything specific. She said she was sorry for the role she had played, by support if not by action, and that she hoped, in time, we could find a way back to each other. She said she was proud of me, which I found the hardest line to read, not because it was insincere but because it was real and its realness didn't resolve anything. I moved out of their house the week after the meeting. Not dramatically, I had boxes packed already, and the apartment renovation had been finished for 3 weeks, and the timing was simply what it was. My mother watched me load the car with a quietness that was different from her usual contained efficiency. My father came to the door once, started to say something, and then didn't. I drove away without looking in the rearview mirror. That was not a performance. I just didn't look. Martin offered me a position at the Hearthstone Collection 6 weeks after the meeting. He was specific about it, not generous, specific. The marketing function for the portfolio had been handled piecemeal, by different people at different properties without coordination, and what the brand needed was a unified strategy, consistent positioning, a coherent identity across all 7 locations, a marketing architecture that could support the next phase of the business. He had read my work. He had talked to my current employer, with my permission. He thought I could do it. I thought about it for 4 days, genuinely thought about it, not as a courtesy but because accepting a position offered by family required more scrutiny than one offered by a stranger, not less. I needed to know that I was joining on my own merits, that the offer was professional rather than protective. Martin had anticipated this concern, which was why he'd framed it in specifics rather than sentiment. I accepted. The first morning I drove to the flagship property as an employee rather than a visitor. I sat in the car park for a moment before going in, not from nerves, from something more like orientation. The person driving to this job was not the same person who had lived at her parents' house filing things in the folder marked "probably fine." The distance between those two versions of herself was not dramatic. It was the quiet distance that accumulates when you start making different choices, one at a time, in the direction of what you actually believe. I got out of the car and went inside. The work was good. Better than good, it was the kind of work that required exactly the combination of things I was capable of, and that produced, in return, a clarity of purpose I hadn't previously had access to. The Hearthstone properties each had a distinct character: the converted manor, a Victorian townhouse in the north, a coastal property that had once been a Coast Guard station. Building a unified identity that honored those differences while creating coherence required the same skills I'd been developing in corporate marketing, applied to something I could actually care about. Martin was a particular kind of employer, demanding in the specific, supportive in the structural, entirely uninterested in the performance of work as distinct from its results. He asked good questions and gave you room to answer them. He noticed things without making the noticing into management. I had watched him build this business from the outline of a newspaper article. Working inside it, I understood how he'd done it, through the accumulation of small, consistent, careful decisions made by someone who understood that culture is built in the details. I thought sometimes about the years of distance, mine and his, the 3 I had allowed and the 10 my parents had engineered before that. What might have been different, what might have been built if I had been paying attention earlier. Those thoughts had a particular quality, neither entirely sad nor entirely resolved, that I had learned to let sit without trying to convert them into something more comfortable. Some things you can't reclaim. You can only make sure you don't lose any more of them. My parents reached out again in spring. Not to Martin first, to me. A phone call from my mother on a Tuesday evening that I almost didn't answer and then did, because not answering was also a choice with a weight attached to it. She asked about the job. I told her, briefly, that it was going well. She said she was glad. There was a pause in which something could have been said by either of us and neither of us said it, and then she asked if I might want to have coffee sometime. I told her I needed more time. She said she understood. I believed her, not completely, not without reservation, but enough to leave the door unlocked. My father sent an email that same week. I read it twice and replied with 3 sentences, that I had received it, that I appreciated that he'd written, and that I would be in touch when I was ready. I meant all 3 things. The question of how much to rebuild and on what terms was not one I felt pressure to answer quickly. Some relationships can be reconstructed. Some can only be renegotiated. Which of those this would be was something I was prepared to determine slowly, with evidence, from the position of someone who no longer needed to make the answer easier than it was. Late spring. A Saturday. I was at the coastal property, the one that had been a Coast Guard station, for a site visit related to a repositioning project. The work was finished by early afternoon, and I had an hour before my drive back. And I stood on the terrace that faced the water with a cup of coffee going warm in my hands and watched the light move across the surface in the particular way it does when the sky is partly clouded and the sun finds its way through in columns. Martin called while I was standing there. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing specific, a contractor issue at one of the other properties, a review he'd read in a trade publication, a restaurant near the townhouse location that he thought might be worth partnering with on a hospitality package. Ordinary operational conversation, the texture of working together. At the end he said, "How are you?" I thought about it properly. "Good," I said. "Actually good." "I know," he said. "I can hear it." We said goodbye and I stood there another few minutes, looking at the water, finishing the coffee. The light kept moving. The coast kept being what it was. I had built something, not the hotels, not the brand, but something in myself that felt more solid than what had been there before. Assembled from the pieces of a difficult year, mortised together by choices I had made when the easier option had been available and I had declined it. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. What this story ultimately reveals is the particular damage that conditional love inflicts, not at the moment of its revelation, but in the years before it, when it was functioning as something else entirely. David and Patricia had not simply neglected Martin after deciding he was financially useless. They had done something more structurally damaging. They had transmitted their assessment of him to Sarah without her awareness or consent. By the time she was old enough to form her own relationship with her grandfather, the relationship had already been framed for her. His quietness was obscurity. His self-containment was limitation. His absence from family occasions was the natural outcome of his not quite fitting, not quite contributing, not quite being worth the effort of full inclusion. Sarah had grown up inside this framing and called it knowledge, because she had no independent evidence to distinguish it from observation. This is what makes the story psychologically more complex than a straightforward tale of greed. The central damage isn't the review campaign, that was the most visible betrayal, but not the deepest one. The deepest one was the years of managed distance, the quiet engineering of Sarah's perception of her own grandfather, conducted so naturally and over such a long period that it never felt like engineering at all. It felt like family. When the newspaper article broke the frame, it broke it for everyone simultaneously, and in different ways. For David, it revealed the cost of his miscalculation. A man he had written off had, in the same years of neglect, built something extraordinary without his help or his knowledge. The response to that revelation, the immediate pivot to family is family, the dinners, the folder, was not primarily about greed, though greed was present. It was about the intolerable recognition that he had been wrong, and that the wrong could potentially be monetized into something that looked like it had been right all along. For Sarah, the article broke something more private. It forced her to confront the gap between what she had been told about Martin and what Martin actually was, and to trace that gap back to its source. That reckoning was not comfortable. It required her to revise not just her understanding of her parents' behavior but her own, the silence she had maintained, the distance she had allowed, the 3 years of reaching for the phone and not dialing. She could not place the full weight of her estrangement from Martin on her parents' manipulation. Some of it belonged to her own choices. What Sarah did with that recognition is the heart of the story's moral architecture. She didn't use her guilt as a reason to stay passive, she used it as energy, directing it toward the one action that might partially repair what had been broken. She called Martin. She drove to his house. She sat across from him and told him what she'd heard and asked what they should do. That movement, from shame to action, was the real turning point, the one that determined everything that followed. The legal confrontation and its outcome were important. But they were the consequence of a prior, quieter decision, the decision to stop being good at the wrong things. What I find most painful about this story isn't the sabotage. It isn't even the years of neglect, as cruel as those were. What hurts most is the image of Martin at that birthday dinner, 3 years before everything came apart, sitting at the end of the table with the quietness of a man who understands he is being tolerated. Bringing wine. Listening carefully. Asking Sarah about her ambitions. He already knew. And he showed up anyway, with flowers and wine and genuine attention, because that's what you do when you love people who haven't yet learned to deserve it. How do you hold that kind of patience without bitterness? I don't know that I could. What I do know is that the people who are hardest to lose are usually the ones who loved us before we understood what love required in return. Martin didn't wait for Sarah to be worthy of his time. He made it available, repeatedly, across years of being undervalued, and when she finally showed up fully, he received her without conditions. That's the quietest kind of strength there is.